so-called found space has its own character already, its own personality, and is more likely to have little faults and flaws and little corners and characteristics that might be rubbed out to make a white cube. White cube tends to be a bit more sterile. So it was almost deafening. I remember walking in there the first time with you when we had that meeting, and it was just like, it was almost like it was haunted, but I don't, not that I believe in that, but just the history and all the little features. It just felt like it had so much to say for itself. Unlike most white cubes are made to be sterile, so they're not interrupting your viewing of the art object. It did. I felt like it was, a found object in itself, and I found it very difficult to separate some of those objects from the space. Not that I wanted to, because I was thinking about it on the bus on the way here, and I had initial ideas, and I just thought that I wanted that space to be a major player in whatever people came in to see. It was kind of patched in some ways, because I think, some of the floorboards, that was the first thing that struck me. There were floorboards, and then there was bits of hardboard, really badly screwed down, and then big gaps, and something, I don't know, funny, something really powerful about the space and something slightly pathetic. And I guess that's what I felt about a lot of the objects I put in there. A lot of them were quite strikingly simple or geometric, and then quite pathetic because they were fallen over or they were crushed, and it was a process that, that text I wrote about it, and it was the process of being in the space, thinking, I'm going to do this, I'm going to do that, all these ideas that I might impose upon it, and after being in there and walking around the streets, and I just became kind of a dialogue with me and the space. These weren't just things brought in and plonked down, they were somehow trying to communicate with the space or fit into the space. Provides different sorts of artists with opportunities that you might not otherwise have if you're not a white cube kind of person. Permanent, if you don't make permanent artworks to be sold, then the white cube it's not really your space. You're not going to be asked into it, are you? And maybe you don't want to be into it, in it.
Another question. Abandoned spaces often seem like art in themselves. Does this make it difficult to mount an exhibition in one?
That's difficult, because sometimes I have been to shows and think, wow, this space is so interesting, that I'm not sure that I really look at the work.
Yes.
And I think it was maybe that's what I felt at Brown St Muse too, in a way. It's just like I just wanted, actually maybe it would have been more appropriate to have been a tour guide, and as people came in and said, come and I'll show you that corner.
But
that
you
I
could
found
have
really
done
interesting. They come over here and see this crack that I found. It's really interesting. Or see the way that, because there were all those weird,
a lovely thing to do. That's great.
Bits in that place.
So Sean Griffiths. Abandoned spaces often seem like art in themselves. Does this make it difficult to mount an exhibition in one?
Not for me. I personally quite like the found space because it gives you something to respond to. I find that in lots of ways easier than a white cube type space. There's a history, there's particular physical characteristics or aesthetic characteristics. So for example, the space that I exhibited, your space that I exhibited in New Quebec Street, had a history, had a particular character. It was very specifically a London space, both in its layout and its decor and the features that were in it. It was also had a future, which the space was eventually going to be developed into luxury flats. So there was a whole history of kind of development and property and things that were embedded in that house, and that was actually the inspiration for the work.
When you knew you would be having an exhibition in a found building, did that change what you decided to show?
Well, yeah, because I think again, if you're referring to New Quebec Street, the piece I made was it couldn't have been more responsive, because it was a copy of the space that existed, that was shifted, levitated and moved, but I went to a lot of trouble to match the aesthetic of the space, because it was skirting boards and architraves that existed in that space, and a big part of the work was scouring various woodworking and home decoration stores to try and match the very particular profiles of things like skirting boards and architraves in that space. So it was a complete, you couldn't, it would have been a completely different piece if it had been somewhere else.
Okay.
And I just find that more interesting. I think it's a bit like a kind of an interesting city or a really boring city. In the sense that the white cube they're just really boring spaces, aren't they?
Yeah, they can be. Do you think it's helped your career working in abandoned buildings?
Yes, definitely.
So, Tom, you had an exhibition. Well, you've had 3 exhibitions with us, but I think 4 actually, is it? 4 altogether. But I think the one that we're focusing on here really is the one you had in Manchester Street, in 30 Manchester Street. It was a film made in the basement. Can you describe that a bit for me?
If we begin with the gallery space itself, as it were, the building was an 18th century Georgian townhouse that had been derelict for some years. It had a fire in it. The piece of work was based in the basement, where I filmed and tracked back from one of the walls in the building through the whole building out to the street side, over 25 minutes along rails through the building. With this, I narrated a sort of story of miscellanea of information, of all the different observations and elucidations and extrapolations of what we saw in the frame as the camera tracked backwards. And this was from a personal point of view, from a more economic, socio-economic, urban point of view, mixing up what may be considered more subjective with more objective observations, and also meandering off from details in the screen and then tracking back to clear details which I'd name and refer to that you could see.
Mm.
Security chain. I'm beginning to wonder how this house worked. This 80s, more modern style door must have divided the flat from the rest of the building, but the flat also had another door onto the street. It feels like it could have been an office, but it has a bathroom and a kitchen.
What do you think the difference is between working in a found building and working in a traditional white cube space?
Both are full of context, but one is explicit and one is implicit. The found space, you can very obviously see the relationship, the contrast between the piece of work and that found space, the sort of deliberateness of the piece of work, and then this aspect of a found space that reveals the processes and history of the space in the city. This is explicit, whereas in a white cube there is just as much context, but it's more implicit. It's a highly specific, cultured space that nonetheless masquerades as not being context, as being neutral. Whereas in actual fact, the white cube has a long cultural history, which goes back to the degenerate art exhibition of the Nazis in the 30s, and has a very particular relationship to how the work is imagined.